So this video is going to be a little different than what I usually do, and that is because I'm not making something, I'm modifying it. This was a customer's table. The beginning of the week it was 2 feet longer, the tabletop, as well as the bottom stretcher was also 2 feet longer. Now this is a pretty old table, it's over 20 years old, so it was made really well. This is all traditional mortise and tenon, so I'm going to show you how I took off one side of this to shorten the aprons and the stretcher and then reattach it. Now if you have a newer table, that process is much easier because usually it's butt joints up to the legs, so you could just take it apart. It's usually attached with screws and chop it down. If you have a more traditional table like this, it can be a fairly involved process. So I'm going to show you how I did that, as well as cut down the tabletop. And then the second part of this video is going to be actually refinishing this table, which is probably for the best because I really dinged it up. I'm cutting it down to size, so the whole thing's going to be stripped and refinished. And I usually don't film stuff like that because number one, I don't do a lot of refinishing anymore, and also I already have one on my channel, but it's one of my more popular videos and people say it's very helpful, but that's cabinets and this is a table, so the process is kind of similar, but the end result is a little different. So the first part of this video, like I said, is going to be showing you how I shrunk it, and then the second part will be the refinishing. So this is my newest project. I don't do a ton of refinishing work anymore because, to be perfectly honest, I absolutely hate it. But the customer's super nice, and the job started with me cutting it down for him. So I just agreed to do the refinishing as well. So to start, I get a couple dimensions because I'm going to need them in order to, especially to do the base. So the top right now is 95 inches long. He wants it cut down to 72. This table doesn't have breadboards or anything, so it's going to be super simple. And then I believe I'm also rounding over all the corners. The table itself is 48 inches wide, and he wants to keep that, so that will be easy. But if you have to shrink the width as well, the process is going to be the exact same as it would for shrinking the length. So before I start, I made sure to measure the base, which is 6 feet long at this point, and the overhang is 11.5 inches. So that means I could use all these numbers to calculate how much to cut the base down to keep that 11.5 inch overhang so that it still all matches up in the end. So the first thing I did to this table was cut off that bit on the end, which is about 2 feet's worth. It's almost an 8-foot tabletop. It's going to be closer to 6 feet once it's done, and that's just because this is a solid maple top. It's 48 inches wide and is about 1.5 inches thick, so even the guy that dropped it off couldn't lift it by himself. So by cutting it down to size, I could maneuver it into my shop, and I just used the base of the table to be able to cut it with my circular saw. Then I put that on top of my table saw, and then I could bring in the base and start working on the base because the bulk of the work will be done with the base. So the first thing I did is I have to remove that one side of the table. This is connected, like I said, with mortise and tenons. So I'm using an oscillating multi-tool because the kerf on the blade of this is super thin, so I won't have to worry about messing up the edge of the table leg. You want to keep that surface as flat as possible so that when you rejoin this apron, there's no gaps or anything in the table. So I'm just going through and slicing through that tenon so you can see it breaks free. I use some tape to try and alleviate some of the mess, but it's still kind of chewed up some of the wood. But like I said, this whole thing's going to be refinished. So then I put a temporary support in between the two aprons because once I cut off the stretcher and the other apron, I don't want them to sag or flop around. So I'm just setting up kind of a rudimentary set of 2x4s in order to keep everything together. I ended up putting this way too close to the edge and I moved it further back. I don't film doing that, but it stays like this throughout the video. So I cut the top apron. I didn't show it because it's the same process. Then once that was done, I could go through and cut the stretcher. Pretty simple. You're just trying to avoid cutting into the part of the table that's going to be saved. So you can see I cheat towards the inside. And then those are my 3 pieces. I'm going to have to cut these down to size and add tenons to them. You could see how that support I added makes it so this whole structure still stays in pretty much the shape I wanted. So at the bottom there was a double tenon, and I just went through and drilled some holes and then chiseled out the excess. Like I said, this table's kind of old, so I don't know what glue was available back then, but it was a little, not easy, but probably easier than a couple-year-old tight bond to chisel out those mortises, which was kind of nice. So just removing that material. Once you get towards the edge of the material you need to remove, it usually flakes out kind of nicely, and those are the tenons left. So this is what the mortise and the leg looks like once it's removed. I'm going to show you how I do it on the other side. You can see there's a little bit of difference in the type of the wood, because you're drilling into end grain here, and the leg is going to be face grain. So what I did, now that I knew the depth, because I already dug out the other one, you could see I put a little piece of tape on a drill bit, and I could see how far I was going to drill down. I used a 1/4 inch bit first to drill a series of holes, and then I used a 3/8 inch bit to finish that up. So now, since most of the material is removed with that drill, I could go through with a chisel and just chisel out the excess. And like I said, you could see where the tenon fits into that mortise. So you're just going up to the line of that old wood and removing it until you get to the bottom and have a nice clean joint again. So I would use a chisel and then some drill bits. So then I'm cutting the aprons, and I'm accounting for the fact that that mortise is 2 inches deep, so I have to account for 2 inches of a tenon on there as well. So I marked out the aprons and then cut my pieces. You also have to remember that you have to account for the thickness of the leg being reattached so that you get the length that you want. So I remove my 2 pieces, and to cut those tenons, because it's still attached, I'm using a router. I made this jig for my router about a year or so ago. I have a video of my channel showing how I built it, and I added a spacer to it so that I could cut these rabbets on the edges of wood. A very thick 3/4 inch mortising bit in there, and that's how I'm going to cut it. So I just have it lined up. I used a piece of blue tape. You could see I have the fence on this jig up against the edge of that apron, and you could see the bit lines right up where that piece of tape is across the whole way. I could tighten that fence in place, and then I could just cut this tenon. Now I had a 3/8 inch piece of key stock, and that's what I used, because this tenon on the side facing out goes about 3/8 of an inch down. So I'm just doing a series of cuts to remove all the material. And this jig, I don't use it a lot, but when I do need it, it's super convenient. Tenons are pretty easy to cut, but when they're still attached to a table, it could be a little bit of a pain. So then the other side, you're cutting much deeper, because these aprons are situated on the outside of the table legs, so the inside portion you're cutting more. So that was about 3/4 of an inch I had to take off. So I used a piece of plywood just to get the right depth, so I could set the depth on my router and get it exact for each one. So same process, I'm just going through and removing that material, because these tenons were about a 1/2 inch. In order to cut that bottom stretcher, I just lined these up on the now cut aprons. I made sure everything was square, and then I marked where I had to cut for that stretcher. You could probably do some math to figure it out, but the stretcher isn't in the same plane as the legs. It's kicked in a little bit on the legs, so it was just easiest to line everything up with the leg in place and redo it. So once I had that cut, I could butt this up and just draw where those dual tenons were going to be cut out. So these are actually wedge tenons, so you'll see how I do that in the end. And I'm just cutting all of right now. I'm going through and just making an edge with a handsaw, so that when I chisel off the material, it will pop off. It's a stop cut essentially that I'm making with the handsaw. Unfortunately, my battery on my iPad was starting to die, so this is kind of the angle that we have to deal with for the rest of the video, because it was tethered to an outlet. But basically I went through and removed all the shoulders on these tenons, And then in order to remove the middle piece, the easiest way to do it was again to use this oscillating multi-tool. These things are another one of those tools that I don't always use, but they're really come in handy for jobs like this. So once I had those cut, I could drill through the back end and then I could remove that center piece. And then I had the two double tenons. Now these will have to be cleaned up. They're not going to be a perfect fit right off the bat. I cut them a little large so I could clean them up with a chisel. So then I had to finish cutting up the tenons on the apron so that they'll fit into the mortises. Now all of these dimensions are based on the original builder. I'm just pretty much copying what he or she did in order to rebuild it. So this is a little bit of a better look of that double tenon, and now I'm just adding the two holes in the back and then the slice so that these can be wedge tenons. I don't do these a lot, so I'm just kind of using a thinner bit in the back end, and then you put a slit in so that when you go to put that wedge tenon in, that piece will spread apart and hold itself in place. And then this is the piece, and I could dry fit that table leg. This is about the third time of me dry fitting it. Unless you're really lucky, it's not going to fit the first time. So this is after I've made just, removing 1/16 of an inch here, slivers of wood there in order to get it to fit. And it's sitting cockeyed on my tabletop, which is why it's a little bit harder to get everything in place. You can see how those wedge tenons are going to stick out through the back side. Once I have it in place, I can move my temporary structure in the middle so it looks a little bit nicer as well. And everything fits into place. I have a little bit more finagling to do on this, but this is essentially done. And I just keep wedges when I cut them off of wood, so those are the wedges I'm going to put in. But I'm not gluing this up yet because I think it might be easier to strip it while it's still in pieces. But that is essentially how you put that together. So that whole base is now about 2 feet shorter, as well as the top. So to clean up the edge of the top, because I cut it with a circular saw, I don't have a panel saw or anything like that. So I find the nicest cut for me is going to be a router. I just took a 2x6, I put it as a fence on the table based off how deep I wanted that cut to be. I kept the same bit in there from cutting the tenons. I just ran it over the surface multiple times until I had a nice clean cut. And this is basically where the table is now. The next video, like I said, I'm going to be refinishing it.